Hi, I'm Luciana Gabriela Soares Santo-Prete, chargée de recherche at the CNRS in the Laboratoire d'études sur le monothéisme. And in this second part of our meeting, I'm happy to welcome Stefan Marinca of the Westfälische Wilhelms-Universität Münster, who will analyze the critique of the Chaldean Oracles in the anonymous commentary on Plato's Parmenides. He has published in the Festschrift for Stephen Emel the article Alcune note sulla triad sostanzialità, vitalità, intelligibilità nel trattato gnostico Le tre stelle di Sette, and his PhD project is about Gnostics, Christians, and philosophers in the 3rd and 4th centuries, an investigation into the philosophical sources behind the Platonizing Coptic-Gnostic texts from the Nag Hammadi codices. So without further ado, I give him the floor. Thanks again for accepting this invitation, Stefan.
Thank you for your introduction. Well, I would start saying that the link between two of the most mysterious philosophical texts of late antiquity, the Chaldean Oracles and anonymous commentary on Parmenides, has already been noticed by Wilhelm Kroll, to whom we owe seminal studies on both works. The Chaldean Oracles are attributed to two enigmatic Julians, father and son, who lived in the second half of the 2nd century. Written in hexameters, and resulting from an inspired exercise, they share a doctrine of principles deeply rooted in the Platonic dialogue Timaeus with their contemporary Numenius of Apamea. Already known and commented by Porphyry, the Chaldean Oracles are considered being of indisputable authority, starting with Iamblichus. Their fortune is therefore closely linked to the truly exceptional reception they received among Neoplatonic philosophers. Nevertheless, the work itself has been preserved only fragmentary, being transmitted to us exclusively through the quotations of the Neoplatonists in their commentaries. And in my outline, I have the two fragments quoted, the fragments 3 and 4, the plus from the Chaldean Oracles. And the first one affirms that the father snatched himself away and did not enclose his own fire in his intellectual power, while the second one states that the power is with him, but intellect is from him. And actually, the work, the anonymous commentary of Plato's Parmenides, says that some philosophers declare that he has snatched himself away from all that belongs to him, grant him both power and intellect as unified in his simplicity, and also another intellect. And although they have not removed him from the triad, they think it's proper to eliminate number in his regard, so that they absolutely refuse to say that he is the one. Now, returning to the Oracles Chaldaicis von Kroll, in his Habilitationsschrift, the Oracles Chaldaicis, which is in fact a philosophical and theological commentary on the oracles, presented in systematic order, Paul observes that at least two of the fragments referring to the Chaldean principles, that is the father, his power, and his intellect, are interpreted in an original way by some unnamed philosophers, already quoted, in a work that Kroll himself edited a few years earlier. This work was discovered by the Italian scholar Bernardino Peyron as a palimpsest in a Latin evangeliary in the library of Turin, being brought here from the monastery of Bobbio. And Peyron had thought it was the work di qualche padre della Chiesa, but instead recognized it was actually a commentary on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides, which he dated for doctrinal and terminological reasons somewhere between Iamblichus and Proclus. Now, this mysterious work gathers 6 thematic fragments within 7 folios that have survived. They interpret, not without a considerable polemical spirit, a particularly important part of the dialogue Parmenides, namely that relating to the first 2 deductions of the first hypothesis. The commentator seems to be faithful to the Neoplatonic interpretation of the dialogue. According to this view, the first deduction refers to the first principle and the second one to the intellect. The first fragment of the commentary argues that the first principle can be described by means of the notion of the one. The commentator thus criticizes the unnamed philosophers who claimed that the use of this notion implies admitting a deficiency in the nature of the first principle. Now, the second fragment proclaims the incommensurable superiority of the first principle. And the third fragment discusses the relationship between the one and time and eternity, quoting a long passage from Parmenides, from the Plato's dialogue. Now, the fourth fragment, the one that's relevant to our discussion, criticizes at least 2 schools of thinking, commenting on the possibility, or rather the impossibility, of attaining a way of knowing God, given the assumptions made in the first deduction of Parmenides. The first school sustains a doctrine about the first principle drawn from the Chaldean Oracles, while the second one is that of the Stoics. The commentator's position is radically negative towards these 2 approaches, which he considers not only useless from a philosophical perspective, but also somewhat caricatural, being compared to a blind person's attempt to define colors. The commentator concludes that we do not have any adequate tool to know God. Therefore, only negative theology in its most radical form can provide us a picture of the first principle. The following fragment discusses the concept of participation of the one in essence, explaining this paradoxical assumption in the eyes of a Neoplatonic philosopher. The concluding fragment explicitly pertains to the intellect, particularly its genesis and structure. It distinguishes between 2 forms or stages of the intellect. In the first stage, the intellect cannot enter into itself and is therefore characterized by the same attributes than the first principle itself. In the second stage, the intellect is able to enter into itself through a movement that takes the form of the triad existence-life-intellect. Preliminary observations can be made after this overview. The commentator quotes and interprets the Platonic dialogue, taking a critical position towards several doctrines supported by other philosophical schools. And even though in the fourth fragment of the commentary, the criticism of the Chaldean Oracles is associated to that of the Stoics, the commentator does not suggest a connection between the 2. Both positions are criticized in the light of that passage from Parmenides, which, in the Neoplatonic logic, denies the possibility of attaining a form of knowledge about the first principle. Let us now schematically see the outline of this fragment. Now, the first incomplete sentence of the fragment probably introduces a first doctrine. So this fragment is actually quoted in my outline, in my other paper. Now, this group of philosophers were probably introduced by oimen in correspondence with oide in the next sentence. The phrase is difficult to understand, however. It refers to the generation of some unknown entities. It is hard to know what kind of entities are meant. It could be the world of ideas, or rather, the two entities mentioned below, namely the power and the intellect. A second set of doctrines is introduced by a different subject, namely through a reference to some other philosophers. They clearly refer to the relationship between the Chaldean father, his power, and his intellect. Nevertheless, the commentator does not quote the Chaldean oracles directly, but rather presents an interpretation of them, which is the creative achievement of those anonymous others. This short expose of Chaldean theology is organized around two contrasting phrases that these anonymous interprets professed. On the one hand, they claim by an affirmative statement the transcendence of God, who has snatched himself away from all his things. On the other hand, in opposition to this premise, they claim by means of a negative statement that they do not remove God from the triad in which he stands together with his power and his intellect. Each of these two premises implies two consequences whose role is to mitigate or even to call into question the initial premises. Thus, even though God is transcendent to all his things, yet his power and intellect are unified in his simplicity. The commentator also mentions the existence of another intellect associated with the first intellect of the triad, but does not give more details about its status. The second premise is the opposite of the first and asserts that God, despite his transcendence, is part of a triad, thereby leading to a new doctrinal rearrangement. Consequently, when referring to God, it is appropriate to reject, to abandon the number, so that these unnamed interpreters of the oracles explicitly deny to refer to God by means of the notion of the one. Now, before looking at the commentator response to this teaching, I would like to underline 2 points that I consider important for the general context of the commentary. The idea that these anonymous exegetes of the oracles refused to refer to God through the notion of the one recalls the discussion in the first fragment of the commentary. There, the commentator criticizes a theory which claims that the notion of one is inappropriate to refer to God because it implies an unacceptable deficiency of his divine nature. The fragmentary state of the commentary does not allow us to tell whether these two opinions concerning the notion of one, that is in both the first and the fourth fragment, are professed by one and the same philosopher or school of philosophers. If that were the case, it would have allowed us to use the critical discussion from the first fragment to analyze the doctrines from the fourth fragment. A second point that I would like to emphasize is the commentator's observation that alongside the intellect, forming a triad together with God and his power, there is yet another intellect whose status is not specified. However, as I have already mentioned, a doctrine that supports the existence of two intellects, or more exactly of two forms in which the intellect is manifested and organized, is extensively developed in the last fragment of the commentary. Once again, the commentary does not mention any possible correlation between the two doctrines that claim the existence of two intellects. However, the commentator leaves a trace of dispute by presenting the intellect as part of the second deduction of Parmenides. The reason for this is that the followers of the oracles hold a triadic principle of an intellectual nature as part of the first deduction. They propose a doctrine which, based on the commentator's logic, cannot be defended in the light of the Platonic dialogue. Returning to the commentator's response, he criticizes the followers of the Chaldean Oracles from 2 points of view. On the one hand, he's rather reluctant, if not skeptical, about the claim that this teaching has been transmitted by the gods themselves. On the other hand, supposing that the gods are the transmitters of this teaching, it could be accurate and true to a certain extent, but philosophically useless. There is an unmeasurable gap between the revelations of the gods and human understanding, so that a revealed teaching can be compared to a blind person's attempt to define and explain colors to other people. Even he has definitions at his disposal, he will never understand what colors really are. The last issue I would like to discuss today regards the identity of the people who transmitted these revealed teachings. I personally subscribe to the hypothesis of those scholars who considered that the anonymous commentary does not directly refer, by the expression "oi men," others, to the two Julians. If this were the case, it would imply that the entire discussion about the relationship between the Chaldean principles is a creative interpretation of the commentator itself, which seems unlikely to me. I think the commentator is consistently following a particular strategy. First, he's quoting a passage of Parmenides, then he summarizes relevant opinions of different philosophers about the topic of this passage, and last but not least, he criticizes them to support and individualize his own interpretation. However, in order to make an hypothesis about who might be behind these mysterious exegetes of the Chaldean oracles, it is necessary to refer the most important thesis about the commentary itself. Pierre Hadot argued in several significant studies that the anonymous work transmitted by the Evangeliary of Bobbio is the work of Porphyry. However, to support this thesis, Pierre Hadot identified and commented several philosophical fragments found in the Latin theological works of Marius Victorinus, concluding that both these philosophical fragments and the anonymous commentary share the same doctrine and therefore the same author, that is Porphyry. A recent discovery has challenged this global hypothesis about the fortune of Porphyry's writings and their reception in antiquity. Michel Tardieu has discovered that one of the philosophical fragments that Hadot has isolated in Victorinus' work and attributed to Porphyry is found in a similar and sometimes identical form in Zostrianos, a Gnostic text transmitted in Coptic but originally written in Greek. This new information implies, for chronological reasons in particular, that at least one passage discussed by Hadot is not authored by Porphyry. This passage, or common source, shared by both Victorinus and Zostrianos, is a solemn philosophical expose in which the first principle is described according to a negative theology, and then, somewhat surprisingly, the same principle is described positively. In other words, the solitary and unknown one from the first part of this expose becomes in the second part known as God, Father, and Spirit, who co-unifies in his simplicity the three powers: existence, life, and blessedness. This expression to unify or co-unify in simplicity applied to the first principle is identical to the one used in the commentary to describe the Chaldean triad. Focusing on this important new information, Haddo observes that the two verbs counire in Latin and synenostai in Greek are rare. Therefore, there cannot be a coincidence. Even if the Gnostic Apocalypse Zostrianos is lacunarly transmitted, we can identify with a high degree of confidence that it also transmits the same doctrine, thus confirming the Latin text of Victorinus. And in fact, according to Zostrianos, Zostrianos affirms that the triple powers of his unity, of God's unity, are complete existence, life, and blessedness. Now, traces of this doctrine can be found especially in two other texts related to Zostrianos, namely in Allogenes and the Three Steers of Seth. We can assume that the Gnostics who elaborated these revelations were very interested in discussing and integrating a theme into their own theology that was debated at the time by exponents of other religious or philosophical traditions. The central question was to what extent the transcendence of a first principle could be preserved despite of its unfolding in a triad that has a pronounced demiurgical function. To conclude, the exegetes of the Chaldean Oracles mentioned in the anonymous commentary provide a subtle doctrine. Its purpose is to relax, if not to remove, the contradictions implied by the assertion that the first principle is equally monadic and triadic in its nature. Thus, his power and his own intellect coexist in the Chaldean Father in spite of his transcendence. Perhaps the moment this triad becomes active in a demiurgic sense, the initial transcendence is reaffirmed. Therefore, we must reject the notion of the one altogether when referring to the Chaldean Father, and that of numerical order when referring to the triad itself. Traces of these doctrines are present in the common source used by both the Gnostic Zostrianos and the Latin theologian Marius Victorinus. Various features of this common source are recalling the doctrine expressed by the interprets of the oracles and the critical discussion of the commentator. It is in fact depicted as a holy discourse, emphasizing the unity, the absolute unity of the first principle. It also argues that the notion of the one can be used only per concessionem, thus only improperly. Finally, this source describes the same one in terms of co-unification of existence, life, blessedness. Luc Brisson has suggested that the anonymous commentary criticizes precisely the Gnostic Zostrianos in the lines about the Chaldean Oracles. Furthermore, Zostrianos itself is inspired by a Middle Platonic commentary on Parmenides, which identifies the first deduction of the first hypothesis with a principle of intellectual nature. Instead, Haddo suggests that Numenius Apameia could be the author of the Chaldean doctrine, as mentioned in the anonymous commentary, while Safre proposes the name of Antoninus, one of the disciples of Ammonius Saccas. Meyerczyk, on the other hand, believes that Porphyry himself is behind this interpretation of the oracles, and that Porphyry is the real inventor of the phrase unify in simplicity. While the others recalled by the commentary are the two Julians. At this point, we cannot entirely eliminate the contradictions that arise when we try to explain the conflict of the Plotinian school with the Gnostics. Also, the reception of the Chaldean oracles, both in the Gnostic literature and in Porphyry, the probable author of the anonymous commentary, is far from clear. However, we can admit that the testimony of the commentary has an historical ground, namely that certain unnamed philosophers commented the Chaldean oracles in a monadic and a triadic way. This interpretation might have been used in a philosophical expose, adopted and adapted by the author of Zostrianos, and a century later by Marius Victorinus. In this expose, however, the first principle is identifying the spirit. Therefore, we can assume that it was elaborated in a Christian, probably Gnostic environment. It is possible that this source was already circulating in an independent form as a holy discourse to which both the author of Zostrianos and later Marius Victorinus had access. The anonymous commentator was familiar with the monadic and triadic interpretation of the Chaldean principles, but he criticizes it with the eyes of a Neoplatonist because of its fundamental inadequacy within the architecture of the deductions of Parmenides. In his view, it is the intellect that is structured in a triad and not the first principle, whose absolute simplicity he defends. The same anonymous commentator extensively criticizes the revelation as an instrument of knowledge of God. He also provides very particular information about those who held such doctrines and who advocated a theology in contradiction to the teaching of Parmenides. It is possible that the commentator used two different themes when elaborating his critique. The first one is doctrinal and refers to the first principles. And the second one focuses on the weak epistemological status of revelation compared to the philosophical knowledge. One might suppose that the author of the commentary made use of information taken from the works written by Porphyry and Amelius to criticize the Gnostic apocalypses circulating in the school of Plotinus. In particular, Amelius' massive treatise, written against Zostrianos, could have been used by the anonymous commentary to criticize those who promoted direct revelation of the gods as a form of knowledge superior to the philosophy, and those who admitted the coexistence of other principles in the nature of the first principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very clear statement of the question, of the problem with all these authors and texts that are very complicated, this discussion that are going on. I will maybe begin just making a question. This hypothesis of agnostic author of the anonymous commentary, don't you think it's a little bit strange that it's agnostic author if they are criticizing the revelation as an instrument of knowledge of God?
Yes, indeed, it is. In my view, the anonymous commentary is the work of Porphyry. I can. It's for this reason, but also for other many reasons. So the commentary itself is part of a discussion of a commentary of Parmenides, which is pretty clear in my view. So he established very strong stratification between the deductions of Parmenides, claiming that the one God above all things is part of the first deduction and not the second deduction, like seems that the interprets of the Chaldean Oracles are doing, actually, even in an implicit form. This is an implicit critique on on those authors calling into question the Chaldean Oracles. Yes, this is a very good reason, actually. This strong critique against revelation is part of the discourse of the commentary, which in my view excludes the fact that the commentary itself is in some way the work of some Gnostics.
But at the same time, we think it's strange that Porphyry could criticize a Chaldean Oracles theory in this way. Because
yes and no, because I think that for Porphyry, the philosophical knowledge is superior to the Chaldean oracles and to all forms of revelations, both Chaldean revelations or Christian revelations. And I would like to suggest that perhaps under or behind this critique of revelations is a little bit a part of critique to the Christians author also. So not really explicitly, but in some way it is the same system, the same paradigm.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. Maybe someone in the room want to put some questions. I don't want to monopolize the discussion. Dylan, please.
Stefan, good to see you.
Nice to see you
here. Been a long time.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great paper.
Thank you.
Very clear, very thorough, and I'm looking forward to working with it. I'd like to pick your brain on the speculation in the anonymous commentary about triads and triadic principles as in its engagement with the Chaldean Oracles with respect to the Platonizing Sethian treatises. One of the puzzles that John Turner struggled with over the years was why the phrase triple power is so strong in these treatises, which often, some of which Zostrianos and Three Stelaes of Seth refer to the invisible spirit as a triple power, sometimes identifying this power with the triad of existence, mentality, and blessedness. And why in Allogenes this triple power seems to be hypothesized, almost like a second one in the Amicus system. I wonder if the Chaldean Oracles and the engagement with it, the anonymous commentary, might tell us something about that. Or do you think the triple power is about something else?
Oh, the concept in itself, I think, we can say that it has a Gnostic origin, taking into account the texts we have at our disposal. The connection between the Chaldean theory as described in our commentary and other Gnostic texts, my impression is that something is missing. And the Three Stelaes of Seth, as well as Allogenes, developed a more complicated doctrine of this triad, adopting other elements which are missing in the anonymous commentary on the one side, but also in all other relevant perception or the reception of the Chaldean system in the other philosophers. And I'm referring here, for example, with the stratification of this triad according to a series of paronyms in the three steels of Set.
Yes, yes.
This is something new, I would say, but it's very, very well attested in Marius Victorinus on the other side. It's more or less the same theology, the same doctrine. So as long as a passage, an important passage from Zostrianos attested a Chaldean doctrine in some way, this phrase to unify or unifying simplicity, a triad, is also attested in Marius Victorinus. And this source implies that Marius Victorinus himself uses a source which is not Porphyrian. I would assume that also in other parts of Marius Victorinus, we have some texts which cannot be Porphyrian. Or we're not able now, with our knowledge, to say that this is a Porphyrian text. So the development of this doctrine, which is I suspect, Chaldean in its origin, but also it's related to Timaeus and to all the speculation about the Timaeus question. In some way, is part of an increasing doctrinal speculative way to describe this paradoxical way of conceiving God as one and free. And for this reason, also the fortune of this idea in Marius Victorinus and in the Gnostic texts, and the misfortune of this doctrine in the Neoplatonic tradition. Between the one should be simple. For the Christian or for the Gnostic also, the one should be dry, free. Also for the Gnostic, the Gnostic triad, the original Gnostic Sethian triad. So I think that in this would be my interpretation of your question in this way.
Working into the paper, it's helpful. Thank you so much.
Please, Professor Garfikova.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your paper. I'm not sure whether I really grabbed everything, but I can remember we had a colloquium on the anonymous commentary in Prague some years ago of Academia Platonica, and there Matthias Baltes from Münster stated that probably this commentary is not by Porphyry, but post-Porphyrian, because the version of Platonism which we have here is more developed than, in fact, in Porphyrian or even pre-Porphyrian. It was also one of the hypotheses. So just it is my question, what do you think about it? That it would be something between Porphyry and Proclus?
Yes, but not Iamblichus then.
No.
So we should exclude, I think, all the philosophers after Iamblichus. Baltes actually, in his book about Marius Victorinus, is also arguing that in Marius Victorinus we have some Iamblichian philosophy. But this is very, very enigmatic. I think that the commentary itself is Porphyrian because of terminological reasons on the one side and for doctrinal reasons. So in my research, I have tried to read the commentary and the terminology of this commentary with the eyes of Porphyrius. And I found some relevant doctrines which are typically Porphyrian. So, for example, the view that the second one is caused in terms of losing of a power. So this idea that between the first principle and its product, or this process from a principle to a product, is achieved in terms of losing the power. Hadot translates this part with "un perdant sa puissance." So the second one is something less with respect to the first one in terms of power. And this expression is typically Porphyrian and is very well attested in the Neoplatonist philosophers. And even if the theme is actually Plotinus, it's a very Platonic theme. The great difference between the form and the product that participates in this form. We have two different levels of reality, and this is good. This is well attested in the commentary, in the discussion in the five fragment, I think. So it remains a possibility. I cannot exclude an author posterior to Porphyrius. And Linguiti, for example, has the same idea that it should be a disciple of Porphyrius, but which one? So
yeah, it's a hard discussion, this one, to have the idea, a very clear idea of this. Do someone have thoughts, questions? Professor Tarrant, please.
Yeah, I mean, just coming in on this whole business of a development of Porphyry, I think one of the things that may be underestimated in the case of Porphyry is just how much he himself developed in the course of quite a long career, and that you obviously have a phase where he's very under the influence of Longinus, and then he's forced to give up some of his Longinan and doctrine under the influence of Plotinus. Then in this new work that we have, he seems to be almost regarding both Longinus and Plotinus as sort of equal teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I would have thought that unless we actually know what stage of Porphyry's life we're talking about, it may be rather difficult to say that it's too developed for it to be Porphyry, because I mean, we know plenty of other philosophers who also developed. Even Plotinus developed in the course of his career. I don't think it's very clear that there is a sort of missing commentary in the Parmenides tradition, though, is it? I mean, we know from Proclus that Porphyry contributed, but I think there may be an implication that Theodorus might also have made a contribution in that area around about the same time as Iamblichus, but that's the only sort of missing piece of the Parmenides jigsaw that I could point to, and I don't think the evidence is sufficient to show that Theodorus wrote a proper commentary on the work either. Even Porphyry's commentary, well, even the commentary that we've got looks a fair bit different from most commentaries insofar as it has this huge lemma in the middle. It's a very long passage of Greek to be quoted directly from the Parmenides, and so that is another thing that clouds the issue. But I think there are other big lemmas in this new palimpsest Porphyry commentary on the categories that has turned up in recent times. So maybe we have other evidence that Porphyry actually did use big lemmata in that way. No, I mean, basically, I have nothing else to do other than say thank you very much for the paper, which puts the commentary in a very different light from the way I'm normally reading it because I'm looking for different connections with different things, but indeed, and the historical overview was very clear and very useful.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I agree with you that we have a big problem with the Porphyrius for reception, because if we take into account the idea that Porphyry was seen as the one who identified the father, God, the Plotinian one, with the father of the Chaldean Oracles. This is an idea which is an information of Proclus and then of Damascus, who identified exactly this theory with Porphyrius. I don't think that this information are really true, I would say. We know that a lot of Porphyrian philosophy is read with the eyes of Iamblichus, which was very polemic against Porphyrius. What remains from Porphyrius' fortune in Proclus could be read with 4, 5, 6 eyes. And I think we have to be a little bit skeptical and to see more in the direction of more original Porphyrian works in order to comment Porphyrius himself.
It would be so nice, and one particular problem, of course, is that Proclus does not name his sources in his Parmenides commentary.
No, yes.
So we may think we know what's Porphyry, but here and there it's possible that we are being mistaken.
Yes, in this consideration, in this connection with the Chaldean triad, Proclus is speaking not about Porphyrius, actually, but about some theologians. Who are these some theologians? So it's a good question. Are they the same who identified in the anonymous commentary the triad, the Chaldean father with the triad itself? Are they different authors? We don't know. But I think this identification of Porphyrius with the phrase of Proclus is misleading in my view.
Just a curiosity, I don't know, do you have some other evidences of this kind of lecture of Proclus from
no, we have,
that is
we have,
not
we have so with reference to the Chaldean Gespräch, we have only the reference of Proclus that Porphyrius has identified the Chaldean triad with the father. And the other philosophers after Proclus have considered that the triad is superior to the Chaldean triad. And so the history of late philosophies is some way divided by this strong claiming of Proclus. And Damascus identifies this opinion with Porphyrius. And for this reason, we have a lot of speculation about what really was the opinion of Porphyrius about the Chaldean triad, which is evidence from Proclus. But this evidence is in contradiction with the works of Porphyrius himself, I would say. If we read the sentences, so the sententia, we gain another Proclus, another Porphyrius, very close to Plotinus, I would say, very close. So I cannot explain why should be the father identified with the one in Porphyrius. I have no explanation for this idea, and the sources in themselves are magra, also not really convincing.
But we have other evidences of this situation that Proclus says something about Porphyry that we don't find in the text of Porphyry.
Yes, we don't know, actually. The work of Porphyrius is lost, a great part of the work of Porphyrius. On the other side, Proclus himself doesn't quote Porphyrius, and doesn't quote Iamblichus, doesn't quote nobody, actually. So we know that more or less, it starts with Porphyrius, the opinion of Porphyrius, and then with the opinion of Iamblichus, and then with Syrianus. And then he says, okay, Syrianus was right because he was my teacher. So, but we don't have real evidences in this strong way, so that we can say, yes, this is a Porphyrian. Yes, it could be Porphyrian, of course, if we compare these ideas with other works of Porphyrius himself, then we can discover a lot of things, of course. But with regard to the Chaldean triad, I don't remember really any other quotation in this way in Proclus. Later, I think, in other philosophers later, in the Mittelalter, but in Xenon, anyway, but not in Proclus.
Thank you. I will give maybe Professor Helleman has a question.
I cannot hear.
We can hear you, Professor Helleman.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, a comment as much as a question, because I've been working on power and the concept of power in Victorinus, actually, and the whole tridunamis. You've opened up quite a bit, and I appreciate the clarity with which you've covered this territory, which is extremely complex. I think there was a conference in Prague a number of years ago where Stephen Cooper has put together, and both Turner and Tomasi presented papers bringing in that Gnostic background for Victorinus only cites the tridunamis once, but he uses tres potentiae many times. And I was looking at his 150 and 152. You mentioned that the verb co-unire is seldom in Victorinus, but he actually uses it in two different ways. And I think it's rather interesting. In the one, he talks about tres potentias co-uniens, and the other one, sine ulla unitioni. And I think what I understand Victorinus doing is that he's using the principle of simplicitas there, that he gets through the co-unitia, which is sort of a composite bringing together of different elements, with that concept of unalitas, which is explained by simplicitas. I think, and of course, Augustine picks up on the simplicitas in his Trinity. But I'm just wondering if, I'm not as conversant with all the Gnostic background. I'm trying to understand Victorinus, and I think Victorinus uses potentiae in a very interesting way, without necessarily always using all the baggage from the Gnostic background. Okay, that's kind of my assessment. And of course, it's a big topic. I'm just beginning to get into it, but I wonder what you think about that one.
Yes, I agree with you. And I consider that Marius Victorinus is using a view of the theological Chaldean terminological stuff and so on, in order to read also the Christian texts. And Hadot has brought into light that we have a kind of identification between the dunamis, the Chaldean dunamis, and the various forms of dunamis in the Christian literature. And what the unalitas in our texts, I think that is a very rare word in the Latin literature. And I was really very interested to see what kind of word is this, because in the Coptic text we have the same abstraction and the words in us. So we have a kind of beatitude, blessedness. So a kind of giving another form of the same word. It's not the monad as translated in many other in the texts. So unalitas, I think, has to do with henotes, monotes, something like that. A word which is very good, very well attested in other Gnostic texts, in Irenaeus and so on. And I think it's in some way enigmatical from a theological point of view, but also as part of a discussion in which some sources could be Gnostic in some way. Also in Marius Victorinus, apart this text, which is clearly Gnostic in my view. So the discussion about the sources of Marius Victorinus are still open, and Hadot recognizes that in some way the writings, the works of Marius Victorinus are mysterious, really mysterious, apart this discovery, which actually is a confirmation of Hadot's claiming that Marius Victorinus used in his work some Greek sources. And this was a confirmation that these sources was a Greek sources, but not of Porphyry. So
yeah, okay. What I'm working with, and it's only a hypothesis, is that he's struggling with the term, the homoousion, for which the Greek then have one ousia and three hypostases. He doesn't like hypostases, he doesn't like personas. So is he using potentiae, one potentiae, God is one potentiae, but there are also three potentiae. I mean, is he trying to get around that term? I mean, I think you have to give Victorinus a lot of credit for struggling with language.
Yes, okay? Of course,
and he's experimenting. I think, is this one potentia and tres potentiae, is that an alternative to using persona or hypostasis, I haven't worked this through sufficiently myself, but that's kind of what I'm working with as a hypothesis.
I think that is really possible because in some way Victorinus invented in some way the Latin theological aspect of the language in some way, because it has translated a lot of texts. Has written in Latin a lot of texts with a Greek mind in some way, and also with Greek sources. And we had no words for some Greek terminological stuff, which was used by the Christians, by the philosophers in the 2nd and 3rd century. In Latin, we had these words, not yet. So.
But it is interesting that Tertullian uses power and spirit and substance, all three, as common names.
Yes, and Nous also, I think.
Victorinus accepts commonality of substance and power, but then he uses power as also three powers. And Michel Barnes, in his book on Dunamis, criticizes Victorinus for positing three powers, as if he's conceding to Asterius. And I say, well, maybe there's another way of looking at that.
Probably that it derives from the way in which Victorinus is using his own sources, multiple sources, in my view, and they are not. It was not able to bring together in a common language all these sources, and for this reason, we have. A lot of real important concepts which are used in a pretty unusual way, would I say.
Exactly. And Jerome, of course, criticized him endlessly for that.
Yes, it's our Heraclitus Obscurus. So it's,
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'd love to see your paper, if I may, at some point.
Thank you.
There's so many interesting points.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I will make Professor Karfikova want to put a question.
No, it is just a small remark to this three powers in Victorinus, which in fact is the Tridynamos Spiritus, isn't it? Which is probably a quote from Zostrianos, isn't it? So
exactly.
Yes, from Zostrianos, but not from Zostrianos itself, because the text of Zostrianos is not identical with the text of Victorinus. So we have to suppose another source before. And this source, in my view, has to do with the the discussion in our commentary about the Chaldean triad. It would be, it's just an hypothesis, we cannot really be sure, but I think that from this old ancient discussion about the Chaldean triad, we have a Entwicklung, a progress toward the source in Marius Victorinus and in Zostrianos, and then in maybe in two different ways, in Victorinus on the one side and in Zostrianos and the Gnostic literature on the other side.
Yeah, but just anyway, I will be rather careful to speak about three powers in Victorinus, because it is just this mention which is probably really taken from somewhere.
Yes, of course.
It is repeated by Augustine in the Ordine, but it doesn't say that Augustine also would develop a trinitology of three powers. So I would be just rather careful in this point.
Tridunamis has a long, very, very well-attested reception in the Gnostic literature, actually. We have a lot of texts in Coptic who affirms that God is, an hypothesis between God or the kind of divinity is in some way tridynamos.
So do you think the common source of Zostrianos and Marius Victorinus could be?
In this form, we have a very important common situation, and that is that both Marius Victorinus and Zostrianos identify the one with the spirit, with a pneuma. And this was an observation also from Hadot. It was not possible that the Neoplatonists use this identification of the one with the pneuma. It's not possible. It should be a problem there. And in fact, from this observation of Hadot, I think that also Michel Tardieu has read this part of Marius Victorinus with other eyes and then identified this part in Zostrianos also. So the text should be already Christianized in some way. By whom? By the Gnostic? It's possible, by author of Zostrianos, or for someone who read or who was a kind of linking, missing link between the Chaldean discussion in our commentary and the Zostrianos himself and Marius Victorinus after that. It's possible that this was a holy speech and was circulating in Rome in the 4th century and in a Christian milieu. And this explains because why this text has a great fortune in Zostrianos and other texts, but also in Marius Victorinus. It was a wonderful text for the Christian Trinity, actually.
So you exclude the hypothesis of some people that it could be from Numenius?
We need more stuff to see Numenius in this. And we don't have any, so we don't have such references, I think, in these terms of conification of a power and of the intellect with the first principle. That the Numenius the theology is also tripartite, but I think it's more vertically organized, and this is horizontally organized, this theology.
I understand. Someone else want to do some observations, questions? Jean-Daniel, maybe? Harold? Professor Tarrant?
Yes, something just occurred to me, and that is that the expression "the God above all," ho epiparsi theos, is a common way of speaking of the first God in the allegedly Porphyrian commentary and in Origen's contra celsum in particular, and not very rare in the rest of Origen, I was wondering whether any equivalent of that expression might be found in Marius Victorinus's Latin.
Yes. Yes, there is some attestation of this expression, but it could be a Christian expression. God above all things is well attested in the Christian text of the New Testament, actually. But the expression in itself is a philosophical one. And Porphyrius is quoting or is taking this expression to defend his own God against the Christian, I think, because in Vita Plotini, he insists that he's the priest of this God above all things. And I read in this, in the commentary, I read this insistence of Porphyrius to say that the one is God above things, God above all things, as a kind of anti-Christian, anti-Gnostic reaction, which explain, in my view, the insistence of criticizing the revelation as form of knowledge superior to the philosophical knowledge. So I read this text as in a kind of critique addressed to Gnostic, to Christian also, in order to affirm, no, the God above all things is the God of Apollonius of Tyana, of our culture, of our pietas, and it belongs to us. We need to affirm this is very, very strong this way. The philosopher is the priest of the God above all things. A very, very good, nice expression, I would say, and evocative expression.
Jean-Daniel?
Yes, just a reaction. Thank you so much for this so clear presentation of the anonymous commentary. My only question is, and perhaps at this time of day, it's a bit too late to start a new discussion, but my question is why the Tractatus Tripartitus of the Nag Hammadi text is not part of our discussion.
Yes, it is part, I can think, of my work, but I had to summarize my paper, actually. I have worked on this paper, Tractatus Tripartitus, and I think that it is the only text who reminds to the Chaldean triad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is clearly another kind of discussion. So I have focused my discussion just on Zostrianos because of this clear expression to unify in simplicity. So for this reason, actually, yeah. But you have right, yes.
Well, thank you for reacting like this, because I also find that the triad of the Tractatus can also explain something of Origen. And the specialists of Origen, in fact, don't really accept to discuss about the possible content of the triad in the Tractatus. So thank you for bringing the question also on that line. But
just as a reminder, the Tractatus Tripartitus is very close to Eugnostos. They share the same discussion, and in my view, they share the same source. Which kind of source is there? I would say a very, very ancient source, in my view. A Christian source, possibly a Jewish speculation in some way in the behind the text. And this part of the text is also very well attested in the Syriac, Aristides' work, the work of Aristides, Apology of Aristides. So we have a lot of ancient sources in some way because of a kind of confluence of these sources regarding God. And this is in Tractatus Tripartitus as well in our Zostrianos is a divine speech, is an independent text circulated probably also in an independent way. And for this reason, we can better explain how the Gnostic texts are built with some Audi, says the Sotim Coptic. So here, and then this is my presentation of God. It's a kind of solemnity, and Hadot has right, actually, underlying this literary genus that is very, very important in order to understand all these texts.
I would love to read you one day on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In this note, I can add that you can, of course, Stefan, if you want, for the written paper, develop this part concerning the tripartite. It will be great if you want, of course.
Yes, thank you.
All happy to read you about that. Maybe it's time to close our meeting. I really want to thank you very much for having these wonderful papers and this very interesting discussion. And see you next year, I hope. And we will give you information about the publication that we hope you are going soon out.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you very much again.